This episode contains detailed descriptions of extreme violence that some listeners may find deeply disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Bogota, April 9th, 1948, 1:05 p.m. The typewriter keys strike with mechanical precision in the cramped office of El Tiempo, Colombia's most influential newspaper. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan's secretary finishes typing his schedule for this afternoon. A lunch meeting at the Granada Hotel, followed by a speech at the Plaza de Bolívar, where thousands of workers are expected to gather. The man they call the Tribune of the People has been receiving death threats for months, but today feels different. There's electricity in the air, the kind that precedes either revolution or catastrophe. 3 blocks away, in the ornate halls of the conservative club, a different kind of tension simmers. Wealthy landowners from across Colombia have gathered for what they euphemistically call a political coordination meeting. But the conversation isn't about coordination, it's about elimination. Gaitan's radical platform promising land redistribution and workers' rights has terrified them into unprecedented unity. As one hacendado from Antioquia puts it to his companions, that mestizo agitator threatens everything our families have built for centuries. Something must be done. At exactly 1:10 p.m., Gaitan steps out of his law office on Carrera Séptima, bustling heart of Bogota. He's a compact man with penetrating eyes and the callous hands of someone who rose from poverty through sheer intellectual force. As he walks towards his lunch appointment, passerbys call out, "Jefe! Jefe! Chief!" Their faces light up with the desperate hope of people who believe, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that someone in power actually understands their suffering. Behind him, unnoticed in the crowd, a young man named Juan Roa Sierra follows with his hand inside his jacket, fingering the grip of a .38 caliber revolver. His eyes are wild with the fanaticism of someone who believes he's about to change history. In his mind, he's not committing murder. He's performing surgery on the body politic, cutting out a cancer before it can metastasize. What neither man knows at this moment, these few blocks, these crucial minutes, will determine whether Colombia finds its path to democracy or plunges into a half-century of violence that will cost hundreds of thousands of lives and leave scars that haven't healed to this day. At 1:15 p.m., 3 shots ring out on Carrera Séptima. The Tribune of the People collapses on the sidewalk, his blood mixing with the rain that has begun to fall in the capital. Within hours, Bogota will be in flames. Within days, rural Colombia will explode into the fratricidal nightmare known as La Violencia. And within decades, the single assassination will spawn guerrilla armies, paramilitary death squads, and narco cartels that will transform Colombia into the world's laboratory for every conceivable form of political violence. But to understand how 3 bullets on a Bogota street could unleash such havoc, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment when Colombia was born already fractured, already carrying within its DNA the seeds of perpetual conflict. This is part 1 of our series on the Colombian conflict, the roots of rebellion. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. When people think about Colombia, they think about coffee. They think about soccer, about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, about the rhythms of vallenato music drifting through the Caribbean coastal towns. But if they're being honest, brutally honest, many of them also think about violence, about Pablo Escobar and the cocaine cartels, about kidnappings and massacres and a seemingly endless war that has raged for so long that most Colombians can't remember what peace actually feels like. This isn't Colombia's fault. It's a byproduct of a conflict so complex, so deeply rooted in the nation's founding contradictions, that it's consumed entire generations trying to understand it, let alone resolve it. Today we begin our exploration of that conflict, not just its modern manifestations, but its historical DNA. The patterns embedded in Colombia's political genetics that turn what should have been a functioning democracy into one of the world's longest-running civil wars. Because here's what makes Colombia's tragedy so profound. It didn't have to happen this way. This is not a story of ancient ethnic hatreds or inevitable resource conflicts, but it is a story about choices, political choices, economic choices, moral choices, made by people who prioritize short-term advantage over long-term stability. It's about a society that, again and again, chose violence over compromise, exclusion over inclusion, regional loyalty over national unity. And so today, we explore the roots of rebellion. How a nation born in the fires of independence managed to embed civil war so deeply into its institutional DNA that conflict became not the exception, but the rule. We are in Santa Fe de Bogotá, July 20th of 1810. In the Plaza Mayor, crowds gather as news spread that the Spanish viceroy has been deposed. Colombia's independence has begun not with a declaration, but with a riot over a flower vase. A Spanish merchant's refusal to lend decorative items for a patriot celebration. It's an absurdly trivial catalyst for revolution, except it perfectly captures what will become Colombia's defining characteristic: the ability to transform minor disagreements into existential conflicts. But even as Colombians celebrate their liberation from Spanish rule, the seeds of future conflict are already being implanted. In backrooms and coffee houses across the nascent republic, two fundamentally incompatible visions of the future are taking shape. Picture the scene. In one salon, the centralists gather around maps of the new republic, drawing lines that consolidate power in Bogotá. These are urban elites, educated in European philosophy, who believe that only a strong central government can hold together a territory stretching from the Caribbean coast to the Amazon basin. They look at the chaos of the independence wars and conclude that what Colombia really needs is order. French-style administrative efficiency imposed from the capital. Just 3 blocks away, the Federalists meet in a merchant's warehouse, surrounded by goods that arrive from different provinces. These are regional leaders, landowners from Antioquia and Cauca, traders from the coast who understand that Colombia's geography makes centralized control not just impractical, but impossible. They've seen how Spanish colonial administration collapsed when communications broke down, and they want a confederation that respects local autonomy. Both groups are patriots. Both want an independent Colombia. But they're designing two completely different countries, and neither is willing to compromise. The period historians call La Patria Boba, the foolish fatherland, lasts from 1810 to 1816, and it established patterns that will haunt Colombia for the next 2 centuries. During these 6 years, the new republic has not one constitution, but 2. The centralist constitution of Cundinamarca and the federalist constitution of the United Provinces of New Granada. Think about what this means. Colombia isn't just politically divided, it is constitutionally schizophrenic. 2 competing legal frameworks, 2 incompatible theories of government, trying to operate in the same territory simultaneously. It's like trying to play chess and checkers on the same board at the same time. The military consequences are immediate and catastrophic. When Spanish forces launched their reconquest in 1815, they don't face a unified republic, but a collection of squabbling city-states. At the crucial Battle of Chaquiri, Patriot forces collapsed not because they're outnumbered, but because the Bogotá and Cartagena militias refused to coordinate their strategies. Colombian independence dies not from Spanish strength, but from Colombian disunity. Here's what makes this period so significant. It isn't just about the political chaos. It's the moment when Colombia's fundamental contradictions get written into its institutional DNA. The tension between central authority and regional autonomy, between urban sophistication and rural traditionalism, between those who believe government should impose order and those who believe it should reflect local preferences. These are not just policy disagreements, they're competing philosophies about what Colombia should be. And once they're embedded in the political culture, they prove impossible to resolve through normal democratic processes. Instead, they get settled through violence, establishing the precedent that when Colombians disagree fundamentally, they reach for weapons rather than ballots. Eduardo Santos, the historian and future president, would later write, "In those 6 years of the foolish fatherland, we established our national tradition of making the perfect the enemy of the good. We chose ideological purity over practical governance. We've been paying the price ever since." When Simón Bolívar finally liberates Colombia in 1819, he inherits not just Spanish colonial problems, but uniquely Colombian ones. The country he's fighting to create has already demonstrated its capacity for self-destruction. We are in Bogotá, 1831. Simón Bolívar is dead, and with him dies the dream of Gran Colombia, the unified republic that was supposed to stretch from Venezuela to Peru. As this massive confederation fragments into separate nations, the rump state that becomes the Republic of New Granada faces a choice that will define its next century. Learn from the failures of the past or repeat them on an even grander scale. Colombia chooses repetition. What emerges isn't a stable democracy, but a political machine designed to perpetuate conflict. The old centralists transform into the Conservative Party, while the Federalists become the Liberals. But this isn't just rebranding, it is weaponization. These are not just political parties in any modern sense. They are tribal affiliations passed down through generations, complete with their own newspapers, their own militias, and their own incompatible visions of Colombian identity. The conservatives draw their power from the alliance between large landowners, the Catholic Church, and urban merchants who benefit from stable hierarchies. They believe Colombia needs strong central authority to prevent regional chaos, but they define order as the preservation of colonial social structures. For them, the ideal Colombia is one where everyone knows their place. The church provides moral guidance, the hacendados control rural labor, and political power remains concentrated among families who've held it since Spanish times. The liberals represent a completely different Colombia, one where individual merit matters more than family lineage, where economic modernization breaks down traditional barriers, where education and democracy create opportunities for social mobility. They draw support from urban professionals, small landowners, and the emerging middle class who see traditional hierarchies as obstacles to progress. Neither vision is inherently evil, but they are mutually exclusive. You can't have both centralized order and federalist autonomy. You can't preserve traditional hierarchies while promoting social mobility. And you can't maintain church authority while advancing secular education. So, Colombia spends the entire 19th century fighting civil wars to determine which vision will prevail. Not philosophical debates or electoral competitions, actual wars with armies and casualties and economic devastation. The pattern becomes depressingly predictable. The party in power governs not for the nation but for its supporters, systematically excluding the opposition from political participation, economic opportunities, and even basic civil rights. The excluded party builds resentment until it explodes into armed rebellion. The ensuing civil war devastates the country, exhausts both sides, and leads to a negotiated settlement that temporarily restores the excluded party to power, only for the cycle to begin again. The War of the Supremes, 1839 to 1842, the Civil War of 1851, the War of 1860 through 1862, the War of the Schools, 1876 through 1877. Each conflict follows the same script. Political exclusion leads to armed rebellion, which then leads to brutal repression, which then leads to temporary accommodation, and finally leads back to political exclusion. By the 1890s, Colombia has perfected the art of cyclical self-destruction, but the worst is yet to come. General Rafael Uribe stands in the ruins of what was once the prosperous town of Peralonso. We are in Santander, in November of 1900. He is surveying the aftermath of the bloodiest battle yet fought on Colombian soil. The liberal army he leads has just suffered a catastrophic defeat. That's not what horrifies him. What horrifies him is what his own soldiers did to the conservative prisoners they captured. The bodies are arranged in neat rows, but they're no longer intact. Hands have been severed and placed on chest. Eyes have been gouged out and arranged in piles. Some corpses have been decapitated, their heads mounted on stakes around the town plaza like a medieval European battlefield. This isn't military strategy. It is ritualized butchery designed to terrorize not just enemy soldiers, but entire communities. Uribe, who considered himself a civilized man fighting for democratic principles, stares at this monument to savagery and realizes that the war has transformed into something beyond his control. In his memoirs, he would later write, "We began fighting for political principles. We ended fighting for the pleasure of causing pain." The War of 1,000 Days, which actually lasted 1,130 days from October of 1899 to November of 1902, represents the culmination of everything that had been building in Colombian society since independence. All the regional tensions, all the ideological divisions, all the accumulated resentments and grievances finally exploded into a conflict that consumed the nation like a fever. The immediate trigger was, as usual, a disputed election. The conservative candidate Manuel Antonio San Clemente was declared the winner of the 1898 presidential race amid widespread accusations of fraud. But this time, the liberals had reached their breaking point. Excluded from power for 8 consecutive years, watching their supporters systematically persecuted, decided that democracy was impossible under conservative rule. The war began with liberal uprisings in Santander and quickly spread across the country. This wasn't the limited conflict of previous civil wars. This was total war, a conflict where military strategy merged with social revolution. where regional grievances fused with ideological fanaticism, where the very concept of civilian immunity disappeared. What made the War of a Thousand Days uniquely devastating was its intimate brutality. This wasn't armies fighting in distant battlefields. It was neighbors killing neighbors, often with personal knowledge of their victims' families, their histories, their individual vulnerabilities. Take the massacre at La Chorrera in March of 1901. Conservative forces surrounded a liberal village suspected of providing supplies to guerrilla fighters. Instead of simply burning the supplies, they decided to send a message. Every male over the age of 12 was herded into the town church. The doors were barred from the outside, and the building was set on fire. As the roof collapsed and the screaming stopped, conservative soldiers bayoneted anyone who tried to escape. But the liberals were equally savage. After their victory at the Battle of Los Cuchillos, they captured nearly 200 conservative soldiers and civilians. Instead of taking prisoners, they organized what witnesses described as a celebration of vengeance. Captives were tortured for hours before being killed, with particularly creative methods reserved for anyone identified as a local conservative leader. One survivor's account, preserved in the archives of the National Library in Colombia, describes how a conservative mayor was forced to watch his teenage sons being dismembered before being buried alive with their severed limbs. The liberal commander responsible reportedly said he wanted the man to die knowing that his family line had been extinguished. This level of personal cruelty required more than political disagreement. It required genuine hatred. And that hatred didn't emerge spontaneously. It was the product of decades of systematic exclusion, where conservatives and liberals had been taught to see each other not as fellow Colombians with different ideas, but as existential enemies whose very existence threatened their own survival. But the war's most lasting impact wasn't military. It was psychological. An entire generation of Colombians learned that political differences justified unlimited violence. Children who witnessed the massacres grew up believing that compromise was weakness, that tolerance was betrayal, that the only way to resolve conflict was through the complete destruction of your enemies. José María Samper, a conservative intellectual who lived through the war, captured this transformation in his diary. We entered this conflict as Colombians who disagreed about governance. We emerged as tribes who happened to share the same geography. When the war finally ended with the Treaty of Neerlandia in November of 1902, casualty figures were staggering. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 100,000, roughly 2.5% of Colombia's entire population. Liberal estimates reached as high as 180,000. Either way, proportionally, it was one of the deadliest conflicts in Latin American history. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The war also destroyed Colombia's economic infrastructure, devastated its international reputation, and created the conditions for Panama's succession in 1903. A humiliation that convinced many Colombians that their nation was fundamentally ungovernable. More importantly, it established violence as the default mechanism for resolving political disputes. The generation that survived the War of a Thousand Days raised children who understood that when politics failed, war began. Those children would repeat the pattern during La Violencia. Their children would join guerrilla movements in the 1960s. Their grandchildren would become narco-traffickers in the 1980s. The war did not resolve any of Colombia's fundamental problems. It just taught Colombians that problems were resolved through bloodshed rather than compromise. The banana plantations stretch to the horizon under the Caribbean sun, neat rows of green that represent both Colombia's integration into the global economy and its continued independence in foreign capital. We are in the Magdalena province in December of 1928. In the company town of Ciénaga, thousands of workers have gathered, not to celebrate the Christmas season, but to demand something revolutionary: the right to be treated as human beings rather than production units. The United Fruit Company, the American corporation that controls vast swaths of Colombia's most fertile land, has created what economists would later recognize as a perfect model of extractive capitalism. Colombian workers plant, tend, and harvest bananas that are shipped to American and European markets, generating enormous profits that flow back to Boston boardrooms while leaving local communities in perpetual poverty. The company pays its workers not in money, but in scrip redeemable only at company stores that charge inflated prices for basic necessities. Workers live in company housing, buy from company stores, send their children to company schools, and receive medical care from company doctors. It's a total system designed to ensure that every peso of worker wages eventually returns to company coffers. But by 1928, the workers have had enough. Led by organizers who've been secretly building unions despite company prohibitions, they've formulated a set of demands that sound modest by modern standards, but represent a fundamental challenge to the system. Actual wages instead of scrip, Sunday as a day of rest, medical care for work-related injuries, and recognition of their rights to organize. The Colombian government's response reveals everything about the nature of political power in early 20th century Colombia. Instead of mediating between workers and management, officials immediately side with the company. General Carlos Cortes Vargas is dispatched with army units to break the strike, and his orders are unambiguous: restore order at any cost. On the night of December 5th, soldiers surround the central plaza of Ciénaga, where striking workers have gathered for a peaceful assembly. What happens next becomes one of the most defining moments in Colombian history, not just because of the immediate horror, but because of how it's covered up, and what that cover-up reveals about the relationship between power and truth in Colombia. Without warning, without negotiation, without even an order to disperse, the soldiers opened fire on the crowd. The official government report would later claim that only 9 people died. Eyewitness accounts suggest the number was closer to 2,000. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the exact figure matters less than what it represents: the Colombian state's willingness to use unlimited violence to protect foreign economic interests. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who grew up hearing stories about the massacre from his grandfather, would later immortalize the event in 100 Years of Solitude. In his fictional version, the government doesn't just cover up the casualty count, it erases the event entirely, convincing the population that the massacre never happened at all. And this isn't just literary metaphor, it's historical analysis. The Banana Massacre revealed that in Colombia, truth itself was a political weapon. Those in power didn't just control resources and institutions, they controlled the narrative, determining not just what was legal, but what was real. The massacre's impact on Colombian politics was immediate and profound. It discredited the conservative government's claim to represent order and stability. It radicalized a generation of liberal politicians who concluded that meaningful reform was impossible within existing institutions. And it demonstrated to rural communities across Colombia that the state would use unlimited violence to preserve economic arrangements that kept them in poverty. Among those deeply affected was a young liberal lawyer named Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, born in the urban middle class but raised on stories of rural oppression. Gaitán saw in the Banana Massacre proof that Colombia's problems were not just political, they were structural. The system itself was designed to extract wealth from the many for the benefit of the few, and that system would defend itself with whatever violence was necessary. Gaitán spent the next 2 decades building a political movement that promised to fundamentally transform Colombian society. Not through revolution, but through democracy. Not through violence, but through the mobilization of popular will. He believed that if enough Colombians understood how the system worked against their interests, they would vote to change it. By 1948, Gaitán was the most popular politician in Colombia and the odds-on favorite to win the next presidential election. His rallies drew crowds of unprecedented size. His radio speeches were broadcast to packed public squares across the country. For the first time since independence, it seemed possible that Colombia might resolve its fundamental contradictions through peaceful, democratic means. That's when 3 bullets on a Bogotá street ended not just Gaitán's life, but Colombia's last best hope for avoiding the violence that was about to consume it. Jorge Eliezer Gaitán collapses on Carrera Séptima. We are in Bogotá on April 9 of 1948 at 1:15 p.m. His blood is spreading across the sidewalk as crowds gather around his body. Juan Roa Sierra, the assassin, tries to flee but makes it only 3 blocks before an enraged mob catches him. And they don't just kill him, they dismember him, dragging pieces of his body through the streets as if violence could somehow resurrect their fallen leader. Within hours, Bogotá is burning. Crowds armed with machetes and Molotov cocktails attack government buildings, conservative newspaper offices, and anything else that represents the system that they believe has murdered their champion. The presidential palace comes under siege. The radio stations broadcast calls for revolution. For 48 hours, the Colombian state effectively ceases to exist. This was called El Bogotazo. And these riots were so significant because it's not just an urban uprising. It's the moment when all of Colombia's accumulated tension finally reached critical mass. As news of Gaitán's assassination spreads through radio and telegraph, rural communities across the country also explode in violence. Peasants attack conservative landowners. Conservative militias retaliate against liberal villages. Local police forces choose sides based on political affiliation rather than legal authority. Within weeks, Colombia has collapsed into what historians will come to know as La Violencia, a civil conflict that will last for nearly a decade and kill roughly 200,000 people. This is the violence that creates the psychological conditions for everything that follows. The revolutionary guerrilla movements of the 1960s, the paramilitary death squads of the 1980s, the narco-cartel wars of the 90s and 80s. Because La Violencia doesn't just kill people, it kills the idea that Colombians can resolve their differences through institutional means. A generation grows up learning that political participation is literally a matter of life and death, that compromise is betrayal, that the only way to protect your family, your community, your way of life is through the organized application of violence. In our next episode, we'll witness how La Violencia transforms from spontaneous uprising into organized civil war, creating the ideological and institutional foundations for the guerrilla movements that still operate in Colombia today. We'll also see how a nation that seemed poised for democratic transformation instead chose the path of mutual destruction, and how that choice continues to shape Colombian society more than half a century later. Next time, on Double Helix, La Violencia and the birth of the guerrilla movements that would transform Colombia from a struggling democracy into the world's longest-running active conflict zone. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.